Jane, Eric called across the room. You don't want to sleep in the boiler room, do you? Jane shook her head. I'll decide quickly, I promise. Barbara gave a skeptical scowl. You don't really want to go away. You like to fantasize, but you won't leave your office. You're not really going. Jane just smiled. I'll be back. Thanks for all your help. I most definitely am going, she told herself, as she left up, and away and stepped onto Center Street. Next to the travel agency was whipped cream, and she considered stopping in for coffee and a chat with Ginny. Whipped cream was Jane's favorite place to eat. Ginny, one of her best friends, so the temptation was great. But then she checked her watch and saw that it was nearly 11. No, not a good idea. She had tons of work to do and hadn't even been to her office yet today, having spent a good hour and a half with Barbara Kaplan. Besides, if she went into whipped cream, she'd probably order a muffin, a definite no-no, because today she was starting the Stilkin diet. Dr. Stilkin's book, Melt to Svelte, had been on the New York Times bestseller list for months. Jane figured if she couldn't be his literary agent, she would at least use his diet to lose 8 excess pounds before her vacation. Anyway, she would see Ginny that night at their knitting club meeting. She crossed Center Street and started across the village green, taking the path that ran past the big white Victorian bandstand on the right and pointed almost directly at Jane's office on Center Street, where it curved around to the other side. The harshly bright autumn sun that had shone earlier that morning was gone. Now, the sky was a brooding dark gray, blending in places to black, and the air had grown noticeably colder. A strong wind had come up. It blew back Jane's hair, made her eyes water. She set down her bag and briefcase for a moment to button her coat. A few brittle brown leaves remained on the ground, scuttling across the faded grass and dancing on the brick path before her. She gazed up at the towering oaks, which provided a nearly solid canopy of foliage in the summer. Now their branches were bare, and between them the foreboding clouds swirled. Closer to the bandstand stood 3 or 4 pin oaks, and she remembered Stanley explaining to her that these trees held their leaves through the winter. A useless fact, it had seemed to her, yet he'd been so serious as he'd shared it with her. Dear Stanley. He had wanted to go on vacation with her. She had gently told him no. This vacation, she had explained, was to be completely hers. It would be her first time away since Kenneth had died a little over 3 years ago. Since then, on top of trying to adapt to widowhood, she had been there unfailingly for Nick at home and for the writers she represented at her literary agency. She needed some time just for herself, and thanks to several lucrative deals she'd made recently, she could afford it. And she would go, whatever Barbara Kaplan said. Jane just had to be sure, had to pick the perfect place. She was nearing the bandstand, grand and white, with its ornate railing. She glanced inside, looked away, and looked sharply back. Someone was in there, someone sitting on the bench. She could just make out the person's shadowy form. It looked as if whoever it was slouching, perhaps asleep. A man, she thought. Who would be sitting out here in the cold, she wondered, eager to reach her office. Earlier that morning, when it had been sunny and warmer, she could have understood it. But now the wind had a nasty bite, and the sky threatened to open up at any moment. Shrugging off the question, she continued briskly toward the far side of the green. As she did, she saw out of the corner of her eye that the person in the bandstand had risen and was descending the steps. Curious, she glanced back and found herself staring. It was a man, but not the kind of man she'd ever seen on the green before, or in Shady Hills for that matter. He was tall and painfully thin, in baggy jeans cinched around his waist with a piece of rope. The tails of an oversized shirt, once white perhaps, now a threadbare gray, flapped above the jeans, and on his feet he wore dusty sandals that were too small for his long feet. Dirty toes hung over the edges. Over all of this, he wore a beltless, olive-colored trench coat that must once have belonged to an enormous man. It reached nearly to the ground and whipped and billowed around his spare frame in the rising wind like a Gothic cloak. One of its pockets was torn, and from the tear protruded the neck of a bottle. She lifted her gaze to his face. It was not an unattractive face, broad and leonine, with a salt-and-pepper mustache and beard. Stiff spikes of gray hair sprang wildly from his broad forehead, reminding